a tutor and two students discussing modern European writers. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 6. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 6.
Okay, so to continue our look at modern European writers who have focused on the future in their work, today we're talking about H.G. Wells. Last week, I asked you both to do some background research on Wells, which we're going to discuss now. Gitanjali, tell us about H.G. Wells.
Right. So, H.G. Wells was a hugely successful British science fiction writer, writing at the end of the 19th and the start of the 20th century, and much of his work focused on predicting the future.
Jason, do you think Wells was just using the future as a narrative device in his fiction?
No. He really believed we can predict the future. In fact, he gave a speech at the Royal Institution in London in 1902 called The Discovery of the Future, and the point he was making was that by looking at what you know about the present and about science, it's quite possible to predict the future.
Indeed. Gitanjali, do you think Wells was always optimistic in his predictions?
Not at all. In fact, he varied in his predictions from being extremely pessimistic about the future to being optimistic. Interestingly, one theory I read links the attitude in Wells's work to his own health. When he was writing The Time Machine, which was published in 1895, he'd just been diagnosed with an incurable fatal disease. Not surprisingly, the book is very pessimistic, being about a dystopia in the future, a long time in the future, the year 802-701 in fact, where there are two races on Earth, the Morlocks and the Eloi, and the Morlocks actually eat the Eloi.
I thought it was interesting, though, that it was H.G. Wells who actually came up with the phrase time machine, so despite being pessimistic, the work has had a lasting effect on our culture.
Right. After The Time Machine, though, H.G. Wells didn't die, of course, and his recovery might be why he began to be a bit more optimistic about the future.
So that brings us to his first utopia, Anticipations. Jason, tell us about that.
Well, Anticipations, or to give it its full title, Anticipations of the Reaction of the Mechanical and Scientific Progress upon Human Life and Scientific Thought, was published in 1901 and was set in the New Republic of the year 2000. Some of the things Wells predicts are fairly close to our reality today, including 24-hour news, global telecommunications, and even a European Union.
We'll come back to the accuracy of Wells's predictions a little later. Gitanjali, how was Wells's work received at the time?
Well, although Wells was extremely successful, not everyone respected his work or his predictions. Another well-known science fiction writer, Jules Verne, viciously attacked him for works such as The First Man in the Moon, which Verne argued weren't rooted in scientific fact at all.
That's right. Now, Wells wrote a number of other utopian visions of the future. Jason?
Yes. In A Modern Utopia, published in 1905, his vision was of a world where there's no private property, where everyone has access to wonderful healthcare, and interestingly, where everyone's personal information is stored on cards in a central database outside Paris. Apart from the healthcare, I'm not sure everyone today would see that as a positive view of the future.
Neither am I. And, on a similar note, Wells strongly believed in population control, and in The Shape of Things to Come, which was published in 1933, he sees and supports a world where the population is kept at 2 billion. once again, I'm not sure most people today would necessarily see that as a good thing.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 7 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 7 to 10.
Gitanjali, in your research, did you come across anything about the world brain?
Yes, I did. It's actually very interesting. Throughout the 1930s, Wells predicted and supported the setting up of a huge world encyclopedia. And towards the end of the decade, in 1938, he wrote a series of essays called World Brain. In these essays, he called for the world to make use of modern technology to create an enormous global encyclopedia so that all our knowledge is available to all people, not just an educated elite. Wells envisioned this as probably being on microfilm. He thought it would allow anyone, anywhere in the world, to look at any book or any document. He also thought it would be created by everyone, once again not just by an elite.
Yes, and as you can imagine, many people today say that the internet has basically fulfilled his prediction. Of course, it doesn't use microfilm, but essentially, it does meet all Wells's main requirements.
Now turn to section 2 on page 101 of your book. You will hear some information about a medical museum in London called the Hunterian Museum, which is part of the Royal College of Surgeons. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 15. Now listen and answer questions 11 to 15.
Good evening. I'm here to tell you about the Hunterian Museum in London, which is part of the Royal College of Surgeons. Although a medical museum, it is open to the general public. The museum specializes in the history of the study of anatomy, and especially the work of John Hunter in the 18th century. If you would like a free guided tour of the museum, then come along at 1 o'clock any Wednesday. Spaces on the tour are limited to 25, though, so it's best to reserve a place by phone, and these tours are for individual members of the public, families, and small groups of friends only. Tours for groups of school students can also be arranged, and these are also free of charge. Teachers are encouraged to make a donation of around £3 per student if they can afford it, but this isn't obligatory. What teachers must do, however, is phone to agree a time in advance, as only one school party is allowed in at a time. Then there's an online booking form which you can use to confirm the booking. Or just send a letter if you prefer. For older students and adult groups, we provide more specialised tours, and these cost £100 for a short tour of 30 minutes, or if you want a slightly longer one, it's £130 for 45 minutes. There is a student discount, however, so college groups would pay £75 for the shorter tour, for example. In terms of facilities available at the museum, teachers and others should bear in mind that space is very limited. As we're in the centre of London, with many cafes and restaurants nearby, refreshments aren't sold on site, though there is a small shop selling souvenirs. Most of the things on show in the museum are preserved animal specimens in glass cases, so there are no interactive displays aimed at small children. And our tours are only in English, although there is printed material available in other major languages on request. There's also a lecture room, which groups can book for an extra charge, and this is equipped with PowerPoint projector and microscopes.
Before you hear the rest of the presentation, you have some time to look at questions 16 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 16 to 20.
Next, a bit about the history of the museum and the preserved animal and plant specimens you can see there. The museum's named after John Hunter, who was a pioneer in the study of anatomy. He was among the first to understand that the study of other animals could tell us a lot about how the human body works. John Hunter was born in 1728 and came to London to work as an assistant in an anatomy school in 1748. Here John did his training in the study of human anatomy. It was after 1760, however, that he turned his attention to animals. That's when he became a surgeon in the army, spending 3 years in France and Portugal, where he started collecting and preserving animal specimens such as lizards. On his return to London in 1763, Hunter set up in private practice and started to build up his collection of specimens. When he moved to a big house in Leicester Square in 1783, Hunter started to take in resident students and gave the name Teaching Museum to his collection. By the time of his death in 1793, Hunter had collected specimens from all over the world, including the first kangaroo to be seen outside Australia. He had 14,000 different exhibits, with 500 species of plants and animals represented. And many of these specimens can still be seen in the museum today, because in 1799 the collection was purchased by the government, who presented it to the Royal College of Surgeons. And they've been looking after it ever since, which is why the Hunterian Museum is located in their building in London to this day.
Now turn to section 3.
You will hear 3 students discussing the issue of waste deposited in space. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 23. Listen carefully to the first part of the discussion and answer questions 21 to 23.
Hey, did you manage to go to the talk by Dr. Chadwick this morning, Andy?
I was there. What happened to you, Sam?
My bike had a puncture. Seriously. Anyway, Ruth, I bet you took some notes. Can you fill me in?
Sure. It was all about space junk. Really interesting, actually. I mean, I knew about how much rubbish humans are dumping here on planet Earth, but I had no idea how much junk there is flying around in space. Did you know that there are literally millions of pieces of rubbish orbiting the Earth as we speak?
Not until now, I didn't.
They reckon that around 100 tons of very small objects, like mainly dust, drops on Earth every single day.
Yes, that's what she said.
I thought space junk was all man-made. I can't believe they know so accurately how much is actually out there. Do they track and monitor it all the time?
Yeah, they do. According to the talk, there are nearly 25,000 objects, larger than 10 centimetres in diameter, now orbiting the Earth.
And what does all this space junk consist of? Isn't it all discarded parts of rockets that were either broken or left behind after space missions, like Apollo and all those spacecraft from years ago?
Well, yes, but not only that. All other kinds of debris that we've dumped in space too. Anything from dead satellites to loose metal screws. There are even tiny particles of paint and liquid coolant.
You now have some time to look at questions 24 to 30. Now listen to the next part of the discussion and answer questions 24 to 26.
So who is to blame for depositing all this rubbish? Where does it come from?
Well, I knew you were going to ask me that, Sam. So, hang on. You can take some of my notes if you like.
Thanks a lot. That's really helpful.
Here, look. Over a third, 37% to be exact, comes from Russia. But other countries are close behind. Another third, well, just under actually, 29% is from America, and then 28% is from China.
Yes, but other countries, like India, are adding to the rubbish pile. And don't forget the European Space Agency also has spacecraft in orbit.
That's true. We're talking serious space junk here.
Pretty serious, I'd say. So come on, what do you think are the chances of something solid dropping from space onto our heads?
Good question. Everyone asked that. Dr. Chadwick said at least one piece of junk falls to Earth every single day. But look at it this way. Earth is a pretty big place, so actually the statistical chances of being hit are extremely low.
Now listen to the rest of the discussion and answer questions 27 to 30.
So are you saying I'm more likely to win the lottery?
Well, just think about it. 2/3 of the Earth is ocean.
That's true. But in time, almost all these pieces of rubbish will fall to Earth because the object's orbit is decreased by its gravitational pull. But the good news is that they don't cause any serious damage. You know, they can't actually survive the heat generated on re-entry. They simply burn away.
But that's not always the case. There are exceptions. Chunks of the United States UARS satellite recently fell into the Pacific Ocean.
The UARS satellite?
It was this 6-ton satellite launched by the Space Shuttle Discovery way back in 1991. So it had been up in space for 20 years, but stopped working in 2005. It weighed 5,700 kilos.
And that's about the same as a double-decker bus, apparently.
And, just check my notes. Here it is, yes. The largest of these great big chunks that fell into the sea weighed about 158 kilograms. Think of the weight of an adult gorilla, Sam, and you get the picture.
A nice soft landing, then.
Dr. Chadwick said, imagine a couple of washing machines tied together and travelling at 100 miles per hour, and you'll get an idea. Oh, and do you remember Skylab? That was another US space station, and it fell to Earth at least 3 decades ago, in 1979. It fell into the Indian Ocean and the deserts of Western Australia.
According to what I wrote down, that particular space junk weighed 100 tons. And let's not forget Mir, the Russian space station. Mir weighed 135 tons, far, far larger than UARS, and it fell to Earth in 2001. It plunged straight into the South Pacific.
All very interesting. Listen, I've got some junk of my own to sort out. My bike. That's the second puncture this week.
Come on, I'll help you fix it.
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now, turn to Section 4. Section 4. You will hear a talk given by Dr. Miranda James. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 35. Now, listen carefully to the talk and answer questions 31 to 35.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first in a series of talks we have arranged for the Overseas Students Association this semester. Dr. James has very kindly agreed to speak to us today on the topic of public speaking, and judging from the large numbers of you here, it's clearly a subject of great interest and relevance. Dr. James.
Hello. It's good to see so many of you here, and hopefully what I'm going to tell you will be useful to you both here at the university and in your future employment. Many people avoid speaking publicly, by which I mean in front of, say, 10 or more people. Not because they lack the ability, but mainly because they lack confidence, which is really only due to lack of practice. Today, as a consequence of the influence of television, audiences expect speakers to be relatively brief and to the point, in addition to being well informed and interesting or entertaining. Probably the most important part of public speaking is what you do beforehand, by which I mean preparation. This includes practical details, such as knowing precisely what your topic is and exactly how long you are expected to talk for. You should also plan the content thoroughly. A good strategy is to write out the content as you intend to say it, and then make brief notes, preferably on small cards, which you use to talk from. This way you sound more natural. You incorporate pauses while you look at your notes, and you can then look at your audience while you are speaking. Never read your speech without looking at the audience. Eye contact is a very important part of communicating with an audience. So deliberately move your head and look around at your audience. Pauses are important, as most people, when they are nervous, tend to rush through their speech.
Now you have some time to look at questions 36 to 40. Now listen and answer questions 36 to 40.
Practice speaking slowly. This gives you more time to pronounce your words correctly. It's always easier for your audience to listen to someone whose speaking is clear and calmly paced, so that they can understand the ideas being explained. And the bigger the group, the more slowly you should speak. Remember to project your voice, speaking clearly to the person furthest away from you. It's a good idea to rehearse and record yourself. Pay attention to your intonation when you listen to yourself. It's even harder if you're speaking in a second language, I would imagine. But there's nothing worse than listening to a flat, monotonous voice. So try to vary your tone and rhythm. This will add meaning to your words. Lastly, pay attention to both your posture and your gestures. A confident person stands or sits in a small group with their head up, chin out, and shoulders back. Try to avoid scratching or fiddling with your hair or beard, or pens, jewellery, and so on. These movements can distract and irritate your audience. Yet you may be unaware of them yourself. Another reason for rehearsing, preferably with feedback from a friend, or better still, on video. I hope these few tips will make your experience of speaking in public a little easier. Remember, practice makes perfect.
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers.